Hi. So today we will look at the aspect of Prakriti as being a system. And when we talk about a system essentially has matrices. Those matrices define how it functions. It has components and then it has factors. In case of Prakriti as a system, the system functions as a cyclic, never ending, consistent object which is in a state of dynamism when we talk in terms of individuals or persons. Those persons can here are supposed to be considered as living beings. They can be animals, plants, or humans. The concept also applies to non living, wherein those are considered as being part of the same system, and hence in English we devise the word nature. The basic component has been labeled as Panch Mahabhut in Ayurveda, that is five elements: space, air, fire, water, and earth. In the previous lectures or discussions, I have taken a point that among these five, space and fire are two components which are not exactly measured in the same way as air, water, and earth, because air, water, and earth have constitutionary character. They make for solid objects that can be seen. Space provides the environment in which these solid objects coexist, and fire is symbolic of the chemistry that leads to a dynamic behavior wherein either these three factors come together or they interact with each other or they translate from one form to another. When we are talking about all of this, we have to realize that there will be measurements, or there have to be measurements. If you do not measure these changes, you cannot establish them as components that have a scientific pattern or as objects that form a scientifically governed process. When you talk about measurements, then you talk about units. And in terms of units, the unit has to have certain characters. One, it has to be able to periodically repeat itself. Second, the unit needs to have either a direction or not have a direction. Then, the other character of unit is that it has to be measurable. Also, the unit has to be part of the system which is being measured. So, looking at Prakriti and all the factors that govern Prakriti, age, which is in physics or mathematical matrices, time, is the only object which is consistent, which has a periodicity, and which can change or changes ideally only in one direction. The subject here that I'm going to pick up primarily, and that is what I'm going to discuss today, is while age is the best component, is the component that helps adjudication of Prakriti, is it a continuous scale or is it a discrete scale? And if it is discrete, why it still forms a scale? Another point that will be discussed is time is basically considered, or age is basically considered, instead of time, let me put it more appropriately. Age is concerned or considered as a limited period. So, how can a limited period be considered a scale, whereas a scale is supposed to be limitless? Because the idea is that a scale is based on a unit and the unit can keep multiplying endlessly. I will pick the idea of it being limitless first and discrete second. So, Vedic lifespan believes that age is 121 years. Now, 121 years is the lifespan. So, it does not really mean that that is the scale. We choose this 121 years as a scale of measurement because this is the only consistent variable in time, which, in the most referred way, has the consistency of progressing in one direction only. This idea satisfies the Markov's chain philosophy, which we discussed in the previous lecture, and also agrees with the principle of stochastics that this will be random, going from 0 days or 0 seconds to 121 years is a very, very long time span in terms of seconds. And how does it reach from 0 seconds to 121 years? The number of possible methods, ways, pathways will all depend on the different other influencing factors which we have talked about in previous lectures again. That variability, when we look at Markov's chain philosophy, or rather the Markov chain's probabilities, let me not put it as philosophy because it is a mathematical model, gives predictabilities based on product assumptions. And mathematically, when you are talking about products, it is not addition, it is geometric, it is multiplicative. When I talk about the idea of Prakriti and I say it is dynamic, I also put the influencing factors in different zones and talk about that when the Prakriti moves from one zone to the other, one kind to the other, its periodicity in that zone changes compared to the previous zone. That change in periodicity has no bearing as to what it was in the previous zone. But the likelihood is always that this continuous movement from 0 seconds to 121 years can at any point go backwards and go forwards. So, when I say that this movement can go backwards and go forwards, I mean that while time will always, principal metric of measurement, time will always be moving forward, the movement of life processes on that line, on that x axis on which we plot time, is very much possible that it will be forwards and backwards. And when it assumes a forward point 1 to point 2 movement, point 2 becomes an independent entity and does not depend on point 1. Whatever happened at point 1 and between reaching point 2 has no bearing now when I'm at point 2. And from point 2, when I go to point 3, again, when I look at things at point 3, it has mathematically no bearing as to how I reached from point 2 to point 3. Because the pathways are very, very many, and the values at point 2 and point 3 are very high compared to any intermediate pathways, which will not have any impact on the change. But there's always a possibility that from point 3, when I choose to go to point 4, this point 4 can be anywhere between point 2 and point 3. So now my probabilities are regressing, going backward. This is only possible when we look at recursions in stochastic modeling. Also, the idea that my point 4 is behind point 3 and then point 5 is much ahead of point 3 sets into practice the fact that my measurable points are discrete. They are spread across a limit 0 seconds to 121 years. The idea that point 4 can be behind point 3 and point 5 can actually be behind point 2 also, not necessarily it is ahead of point 3, signifies that progression of age or aging can be slowed down. This also means that this entire process has measurable time frames, but they are all discrete. And the moment it becomes discrete, aging or age as a process, the standard along which all the Prakriti dynamism is being measured, becomes discrete. And hence, a stochastic process of this nature becomes a discrete scale. Age does not remain a continuous scale but becomes a discrete scale. This has a different magnitude of impact. This different magnitude of impact is borne by the different physiological systems or srotas as we call them in Ayurvedic context. Each srotas has its own life cycle equal to 121 years. The life cycle of that srotas has an impact on other srotas because of mutual interactions, and since they are 13 in number, the number of possible permutations that will arise is very, very high. The number of permutations being very, very high also allows for the possible interaction pathways from one srotas to the nth srotas, the 13th srotas, if I were to put them on a number line, is innumerable. It can be any form of a chain, and the impact on each srotas of each condition will be different. So while one srotas may be accelerated in aging, the other may be slowed down. This has a natural provision within nature. When we talk about 121 years, no, this has no provision, because in an ideal state, we are assuming that the person was born in X conditions and dies at 121 years in the same X conditions. Barring the idea that there will be seasons, there will be a day, and since those are cycles, cyclic in character, so the change in a day, change across seasons, will ultimately end up in a vector zero condition. And a vector zero condition will mean that there are zero probabilities of a change except the aging process continuing. And that will be because of non cyclic factors like social interactions, individual behavior, etc. Those factors which do not repeat by themselves. This point, however, when it comes into practice and interactions occur because of change in the nature of even the cyclic factors, because of change in non cyclic factors. I repeat, change in the character of cyclic factors because of change in non cyclic factors. That means the non cyclic factors have a greater bearing on cyclic factors. And this complexity actually is where all the geriatric care centers around. The progression, the aging is therefore continuous again. And this is all happening within a space. That space is the space that we talk in terms of Panch Mahabhut, Gagan. So, the other indomitable factor that is not physically measurable apart from space becomes Agni, which is the cause and which is also the product. I repeat, which is also the cause and which is also the product of these interactions. Like we were moving from point 1 to point 2, point 2 to point 3, point 3 to point 4 backwards, point 4 to 5 forwards or backwards. Any such rules that get established for each individual separately make for the idea that thermodynamics is the only thing that actually explains Prakriti behavior. This Prakriti behavior is why it is very, very critical to understanding of Ayurveda practice in terms of medicine, and Ayurveda processes. This discrete character lends a vector quantity, a parallel scalar character as well at a particular assumed point. Because when the probabilities are being made as to where the next transition is going to happen, it is in a three-dimensional space and it can be in any direction. It may not be linear, it can be assumed to go in either directions, up or down. Following the thermodynamic principles and patterns, the transition from 2 to 3 therefore is not linear but a waveform. So now the scale of aging, or aging being the scale, becomes not a straight line but a waveform, which in an ideal state is a sinusoidal wave, but in clinical models, it may not be a sinusoidal wave but just a wave with inconsistent patterns, inconsistent frequency, inconsistent amplitude, and therefore energy states at each of the wave cycles within the complete wave will be variable. Sometimes these energy changes would be very, very sharp, and sometimes these could be very, very subtle. When these are very, very sharp, they will reflect in the form of traumatic behavior. It can be a sound, it can be a color, it can be a high or low temperature. And when it is subtle, over a period of time, it will reflect as endocrinal or immunological, or it will reflect as anything else that has to do, say, with endocrinal and neurological functions and uh, any such manifestations immediately. When you talk about traumatic behavior in terms of temperature or change of color, etc., those refer to accidents, infections. In these conditions, there will be a question by new kids, by even the seasoned, as to where do you place something like cancer or an AIDS or an autoimmune, which have mixed pairings, whose start could be slow and suddenly explode. So, those I would always put in the slow, inconsistent, or consistent waveform pattern. It has nothing to do with the traumatic side. But when it explodes, is because of their own waveform character, which in some form tends to accumulate the thermodynamic behavior as pockets, perhaps. This is something I'll explain somewhere in the series down the line. And those pockets exploding when they go beyond a threshold of latent standing. So, aging process, like we discuss and conclude here, is that more of a waveform pattern, inconsistent waveform pattern in the clinical sense, and that is why the age of a person is variable. Everybody doesn't live 121 years. These disease patterns, which have an explosive character, they would transition between potential energy, latent energy, and active energy. This behavior is yet again measurable linearly, and it is talked about, it is considered across a straight line of time. So that time correlation comes back to age, and that is why age becomes a standard, and age has a coefficient character, linear in nature, but in a three dynamic space, unlike to be assumed on just a two dynamic axis of x and y. I will welcome questions on this. I will be expecting questions around this until the next point in discussion. Till then, stay healthy, stay happy. Good night.